Hello and welcome back to our study through the Gospel according to Mark. We're in Mark chapter 14 this week, and before we jump in, I want to set a little bit of context for where we are in the book and in the life of Jesus. From Mark 14 through chapter 16 is the last week or so of Jesus' life. We are looking at mere days described here. And so Wednesday begins Mark chapter 14, and then the Passover is going to be Thursday, and then the crucifixion is on Friday. And so what's interesting is when you start out the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is around 30 years old. And for the next 13 chapters, we're covering 3 years. And then just 14 through 16 are several days. This is the emphasis, this is the focal point of why Mark is writing at all. It centers on the events of the week of Passover and ultimately the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Now, in our passage for today, verses 1 and 2 start out with a plot to murder Jesus. The religious leaders have had it. There have been numerous times before when they've thought about killing him, but now they are committed to do it. Just not during Passover. They don't want a riot. There have been riots during Passover in the past, and as long as the religious leaders were able to keep the peace on their own, Rome would leave them alone. But if they couldn't manage their own people, Rome would step in, and they don't want that because that means less authority and power for themselves. So there's this plot to murder Jesus that's coming together. And then Mark moves from that, just after 2 verses, to talking about a woman who pours expensive perfume on Jesus, who anoints him in that way with a wonderful display of worship. And then after that story, we go back to the betrayal plot, where Judas now, one of the 12 disciples, is betraying Jesus to the religious leaders for money. Matthew tells us for 30 pieces of silver. And what's interesting is we have this first section of betrayal, this middle part, which is totally different, it seems, where we're seeing worship displayed to Jesus, and then we go back to betrayal. Now, there is a theological word for this. It's called intercalation, and I don't expect you to remember that, because basically all it means is a sandwich. Mark makes these sandwiches. The other gospel writers make these kind of textual, biblical sandwiches where they start out with one part of a story, go to something that seems different and unrelated, and come back and finish out the first part of the story. And one of the things just right off the bat this shows us is the Gospels are well-crafted literature. These aren't accidental things. It's not like, Mark had ADD. That's not what's happening here. He intentionally arranged it in these 3 sections. Now, why? It shows a stark contrast, doesn't it? You go from religious leaders who should be the ones that are leading the people in the worship of God, they're trying to murder Jesus, to a woman, low social standing, who is lavishing everything she has on Jesus. And then you come to one of the disciples who should have been even closer to God, perhaps, than the religious leaders, and he is participating in this betrayal plot. By putting these things next to each other, Mark is showing us just how strong the contrast is. It could not be more strong. The woman close to Jesus, worshiping Jesus, understands who he is and his worth, and Judas, who should be in the position to know, does not. Mark does the same thing with the fig tree that Jesus curses. These are all throughout the Gospels. Now let's spend some time talking about the woman pouring expensive perfume on Jesus. Now the perfume she poured on him was likely worth about 1 year's wages. So think about how long it would take to save up enough to have an extra year's wages that then you would spend on perfume, that then you would pour out in worship on Jesus. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of money. And what we see in this passage is the disciples, and John tells us it's largely started by Judas, react very strongly against this. They think the money should have been sold and given to the poor. And in effect, what they're saying, right, is Jesus is unworthy of that much worship. That's not a place we want to find ourselves. When we are criticizing the worship of Jesus, when we underestimate and ill-esteem Jesus' worth. But that's what's happening here. Now, as we look at this account in the different Gospels, it seems like there are a few times that someone pours perfume on Jesus or anoints him. Now, not all of these are the same. So there's an account in Mark, we're looking at it here, and in John, and in Luke. Now, not all of these are the same. Luke's account was earlier in Jesus' ministry. I think it's a different event. But John, in John 10, seems to be describing the same thing that Mark is describing here. But they appear different. And there are some people who would like to poke at this and say, see, there's a contradiction in the Bible. Because what it seems like is, well, John is saying that Mary is the one who anointed Jesus. Mark doesn't say her name. And John is saying that Mary anointed Jesus' feet with perfume, and Mark says it's his head. And John says that Mary wipes his feet with her hair, and Mark doesn't say that at all. So obviously, this is a contradiction in the Bible. And one of the sad things about people who take this approach is they would give much more grace to their own writings, to their own speech, to things that are written today than to biblical writers. Because there's nothing contradictory about one person saying that the woman poured oil on Jesus' head and the other person saying that the woman, Mary in this case, poured oil on his feet. If you're pouring out about 12 ounces of oil, which is probably what she was doing, it's going to go everywhere. The perfume is going to anoint all of Jesus. And in a small house, it's going to smell very, very strong, for lack of a better term. So there's no contradiction here. No one is saying that he only had his head anointed or he only had his feet anointed. They're pulling out different details in the same way that other gospel writers pull out maybe Jesus as prophet or Jesus as priest or Jesus as king at different points or Jesus as a suffering servant. There are multiple different dimensions of any circumstance that can be pulled out. It's the same sort of consideration when we talk about how many women were at the tomb. Was it one? Was it two? Was it three? Well, the Gospels tell us different accounts. They will mention certain people and not mention others, but it's not contradictory because no one is saying there were only two people or only three people or this Mary wasn't there. So each of the Gospel writers is bringing out different details that they think are important, and that doesn't mean it's contradictory because they're not mutually exclusive. So we've looked at the fact that Mark and John are talking about the same thing, and this is an opportunity for us to talk about how we read our Bible. There are two ways, largely speaking, to read the Gospels. You can read them vertically, and by that, think of just going down the page. Like I read this section, then this section, then this section, and I just keep making my way through. That's how most of us read the Bible. But a tendency some of us have when it comes to the Gospels is to also read horizontally. So we want to find something that Mark talks about, and then find where Luke talks about it, and find where Matthew talks about it, and find where John talks about it, and line them all up, and kind of understand them as the totality of their details. Kind of maybe a lowest common denominator or maybe greatest common denominator kind of thing. And that can get us into trouble because there's a reason why Mark doesn't include some of the things that John includes. And there's a reason why John includes more than Mark does. And so when we bring all of these Gospels together, we can learn things that are helpful. I think that's true. We learn details from John that help us understand a little of the context of Mark, but we can't use those to somehow miss why Mark is saying things the way he is saying them. Mark does not use Mary's name. The focus for Mark is not on Mary, although she is a good example here in some ways. The focus of Mark is on Jesus. So in our desire to read the Gospels and understand all of the context, yes, there is benefit to reading horizontally, but let's let each individual Gospel writer also present his narrative, his account, vertically. Because if we do that, we understand that Mark has arranged things in a certain order. One of those sandwiches, right, to make the contrast even stronger between those who wanted to kill Jesus and just how worthy of worship Jesus was. And so that should be one of our takeaways from this passage, that we see a Jesus who is supremely worthy of worship. Let's not be people who are close to religion but have hearts that are far from God. Let's be encouraged by what we've seen here with the worship of Jesus, and let us do that with everything we are and everything we have.